Welcome to the Counterweight podcast. I am Doug Rogers, Chief Revenue Officer and Managing Partner for Waypoint Healthcare Solutions. And I'm joined weekly by my co-host, James Canary, founder and owner of the Upper Right Corner. Together, we are focused on speaking to and learning from growth leaders across the healthcare space about their journeys and lessons learned. James and I want to explore how growth leaders manage this tension not only for their teams, but also with their leaders and in many cases, board members and investors. We will discuss with our guests the career journey they have been on, key influences that help them put them into the position they are today. We will talk about successes and challenges, what they learned from these events for themselves and for their teams. Join us each week for a new episode with our guest. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn under the name The Counterweight Podcast. Subscribe, like, follow, and give us feedback as we go along. Now on to the show. Welcome to The Counterweight. This is another episode with my co-host, James Canary. I'm Doug Rogers, and I am beyond excited. I feel like I'm always beyond excited, but I am even more so excited this morning to welcome Amie Teske to the pod. We're going to have a phenomenal conversation. This is going to be a great experience. Amie, why don't we just first start? I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing these days, and then we'll dive right in.
Hey guys. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Okay. What am I doing these days? I'm still in health tech.
Yeah, there you go.
Congratulations.
Yes, still here.
Maybe congratulations.
I know, love-hate relationship. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm doing now, so 20 years in the industry, what I'm doing now is a few things, something called the Echelon, which you guys know about, which is just a community for health tech sales professionals. And alongside that, I do advisory services for growth. Specific to health tech, a lot of the principles are the same, across different industries. There's nothing terribly novel, but there is an appreciation for this industry. And there are some nuances that, have to be taken into consideration from an advisory perspective. So a lot of my advisory type of work, while in the trenches looks a lot like, can include things like go-to-market stuff and some of those motions and getting those more efficient and streamlined. But my love and my passion, where I lean more, and the customers that I talk to are more around just team and how to keep the productivity levels of a sales organization on point and high. We're all high achievers, and just like we're all human too, though we drift. So, a leader's job is, my opinion, is the people and how to keep them focused on the achievement that they want to see. So those are the main things that I do now.
Well, that's such a powerful.
Can you share kind of what led you to that decision to create the Echelon, to do the more of the consultative approach versus joining companies full time or being a chief revenue officer somewhere? What kind of led you down this path?
So when I left corporate for the second time, so I started advisory and like sales consulting type of work in 2017. And then in that work, I found my last company, Simpler. And then I was there for 3.5 years, which was a fun journey. And so when I left Simpler, I took a little time off with the family, kind of like mid-career. I'm lucky enough to say that I could do something like that, time with my family. And then I dove back in. But when I dove back in, it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm an advisor, but it feels so squishy. So I was like, how do I stay relevant and figure out exactly what this business needs to form itself to be? And so that's when the Echelon really started. And at first I didn't call it, it wasn't that. It was purely, how do I stay relevant? And so I just went talking to health leaders. I was like, I've been in the industry for 20 plus years, and I've always sold to health leaders. So there was always an intention. And so I wanted to just understand, almost like an unlearning process, what are their real expectations of sales? And has there been anybody who's exceeded them or met them? Who are they and what was their impact? And
from the other side, not from the corporate side because the corporate side says, what's your attainment, right?
Mhm.
What was your quota? What'd you attain? What's our growth percentage? What's our, right?
It was all the
Annual
numbers.
right? So you were going from the other side. You're going from the client or the customer side.
Yeah, because who better to say if a salesperson had impact or not,
Yeah, they're
than
right on the other side of it.
the person on the receiving end.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I would take those. So that was the unlearning. I was just naturally curious. Like, tell me, like, I'm unbiased. I don't work for a company that's trying to sell you anything. Which, by the way, it's really hard to get the time and attention of CIOs and health leaders, even when you're not selling them anything.
Yeah,
So
I imagine.
Note to self to salespeople, like it's hard. They're busy people.
It's just hard, period. Right?
Yeah.
It's that getting that time is difficult regardless of what your intention is. But I am curious. I mean, when you did get their attention, what was their reaction?
When I actually got them and sat down and this started with, I sat at, a coffee shop at Chime, the one that was in the center of where everybody would go.
Yeah.
And I would just, while they're in the middle of eating their blueberry muffin, I'm like, hey, can I grab a couple minutes?
Right after they take a bite too.
Yeah. Right. And they're like,
they've got to eat.
Yeah.
They're going to finish the muffin.
You're right. And so that's how it started. And their reaction usually was, oh, yeah. And most of the things that I learned weren't novel, right? We could probably guess them. But there's probably a good 10% of what I learned that would be, hadn't thought about that. And I'll tell you what some of those are. And some of them were like, oh, I'd probably reorg. If I had to go through a whole reorg, like I've done, I would do things actually a little bit differently because of this.
You mean like align differently with the client? Meaning like how they want to buy versus how we think they should buy?
Yes.
Or how, okay. And can you, before you jump into some of that, maybe provide a little more context for our listeners? When you were approaching these leaders in healthcare IT, what were some of the titles, the types of leaders that you were talking to while they were trying to munch on their blueberry muffin?
It was primarily CIOs, but then I didn't want to pigeonhole either. And so I talked to VP of applications. I didn't go departmental at first because really the intention here is I wanted to get the voice of my customer's customer, right? Yeah. And so my customers are health technology sales leaders and their team and their people. And so it's this idea of like, let's fight for what they care about. And I was curious, right? I'd always been, that's the role I'd been in. So I was just curious for my own purposes too.
So I do want to go back to what you just said. What was the insight or one of the insights in terms of how you would think about realigning an organization to be more effective, engaging, supporting, or moving an opportunity forward with organizations and these individuals?
The number one theme of all of them, and I've done hundreds now, the number one theme consistently, even still to this day, is don't vanish. So as a salesperson, the normal behavior of a salesperson is sign a contract and then I might run into you at a conference again.
Right. Hey, I hope you're doing all right. I got to go talk to this other person.
Yeah. And they
get reorged and they're no longer assigned in that territory and they disappear.
Right. They'll acknowledge that. They'll acknowledge that, look, I understand companies reorg and I understand that people come and go too, different companies. And that really wasn't their point. I mean, kinda like there's a finish the job. You sold me something, but follow through. That I don't think is that drum. We don't beat that drum as leadership near as much. And it's honestly to our own detriment. So when I say I would reorg a little bit differently, there'd be a little bit of how do I orient the chairs on the, on the deck here, but there's a little bit of comp planning in it too. How would I compensate my salespeople to make sure they're following through? If for no other reason than the storyline being your best leads are referrals.
For sure.
And so
yeah.
who has how many, I mean, just turn it around on you guys, even like how many times do we build referral strategies as part of our go-to-market sales execution plan and emphasizing that and measuring it and monitoring it. I didn't back in the day.
What I've seen is that bifurcation between client development, right? So new business, your hunters and your farmers, which is your account management, your reps that are for the installed clients, so to speak. So there's a lot of companies put that line there in the sand, right? And they never use those exact words, but that's what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you see companies do. So then how do you, I've seen where if you have reps hanging around too long, then they hover near the installed base and they don't go hunt.
Yes.
So then how do you do that where you create some consistency and the relationships and the file and the referenceability and all that, and yet also go grow the business?
Yeah. To use probably a very apropos word, it's attention to manage. It really is. And just like anything when you're dealing with people, but there was a anonymous CEO. I heard this quote one time, which I always thought was very good. There wasn't a name to it, but other than CEO. And it was like, I hate process, but I love what it gives to me. And it's like the freedom that it gives you when you have that in place. And so a process, and I share the sentiment, is working through the details of process is a project by itself. And there's some people who just live and die and love that stuff. And God love those people. And I know a few of them, and man, I keep them close.
They're a good balance.
Yes. You know, so I think I think there's a little bit of setting the expectation, compensating for the behavior that you desire, and then managing for, you don't want the extreme to go too far one way or the other.
Yeah. I just to spend just a little bit more time, because I do think that this is both organizationally and strategically a very fascinating topic, which is how do you invest in your teams to get the outcome that you want? And the outcome that you want is growth. And you want both growth on the new logo side, and you want growth within your current client base. Amie, I'd just be curious, what are some things you would recommend in terms of incentives? Whether you have a new business team and a current client team, whether you have a team that's responsible for both, they have a hybrid environment. What are a couple of tips or tricks that you would recommend that a leader should think about or try to do with their team to avoid that chasm of I've left, I'm gone, and now the client feels like unmoored, almost like they're ship at sea and they have no safe harbor, where before they felt very comfortable?
I think there's a few things. I think it starts, I think that there's a 4-letter word that is the most important word when it comes to sales. And it's HIRE. It's hire. You have to hire for the kind of people that are going to execute on the behavioral expectations of your sales organization as a leader. And so there are some things you can't teach. And so that's kind of the squishy part of the answer is you have to hire for the right people. But I think we underplay that so much. I mean, who likes to put together jobs? I mean, how many times do you, as a sales leader, you're like, oh, good night, I have to go, hire in the recruiting and all of the things. And because we dislike it so much, we underplay it when the power is really in the people that you bring in. So I think that there's more emphasis, to that than there should be. So it starts there, because they're also the people who can take the feedback, like, hey, you're spending too much time there. They're like, yeah, I got it. But when it comes to the actual execution and how you get people to do the referrals, I think the next step is also the leaders, and the leaders is painting that picture on why referrals are important. Referrals, and I know I'm staying on the topic of referrals because, don't vanish to me. translates from a strategy perspective. Like that's the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And referrals isn't like, we're at the end of the sales cycle and I want you to talk to a customer. That's how referrals have been defined for us.
Right.
And so I think that there are structures in place that you could put in. Again, I've learned a lot of this, or how it execute on it would be a little bit different, but I do think that there would be some sort of measure that would say, are we doing it? Are we not? It's almost, think about activity precedes results. The idea of you're measuring the kind of activity you want your salespeople to do, because they produce the kind of results that you want. This would just be another one. So how many times are we having the kind of conversation where we are introduced by way of a current customer personally?
Right.
That's right.
Not just a last minute reference call like, oh yeah, I got this deal on the line. I need a friendly call. It's unprompted, unsolicited referrals.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like pause here too, because just to role play, right? A little bit on that. It's not like, hey, give me the 10 people. The way that can sound very authentically and genuinely is, this is my patch. This is my territory. Always good to see you. Hopefully you've asked the questions of how is the project going? Is it meeting the original intent? Like you should be having those conversations. And then it can follow with, hey, I'm trying to talk to Jane at, your neighboring hospital. And I saw that you're connected. Any chance you have any insight on Jane, like what she's done in her background? So like modern day prospecting is research.
Yes.
You have to spend so much time understanding and learning, and then leveraging your network more than we do. And referrals is part of it. So it doesn't have to be this robotic, systematic, asking for referrals in a very, because you're told to.
Have our reference team contact you.
You're right.
I always hated that. It always felt very contrived.
Yeah.
So I love just that organic conversational relationship first.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the classic, like, hey, you've worked with us now for a few months, assuming there's no dumpster fire, project's going well, right? It's, hey, who else do you know that might benefit from this kind of experience, product, whatever it is, right?
Because they know you're in sales. Like, it's okay to admit that.
For the most part, they want to help. Like people want to help other people.
Mm-hmm. Especially people that they
good,
trust.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So to that point, here's another thing that I learned is the number of health leaders that I talked to that said they follow the person. Which
I find that remarkable. I do. I love it, but I find it remarkable.
Me too.
Verify, meaning they follow the person to their next, if they go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. So like
the rep, the sales leader or the rep.
Yep. So if you did a good job for them, let's separate the fact that maybe the product didn't meet their needs. We're working with people who are in a role who understand that difference. And when you call on them at your next company, they'll take your call.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And and the trust extends even beyond that. Like if you picked this company, you picked it for a reason. And so it's what I always call a soft knock. And we're always looking for soft knocks. Like you don't have to like bang on the door, let me in. It's like, soft knock. They're like, yeah, come on in. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. And they follow. I'm with you, Doug. It kind of surprised me. I don't know why, but I was like, oh, okay. So note to companies even listening.
Well, I will say part of the initial surprise when I've heard you talk about that concept is that it really reorients that it's not the product per se that people are buying. Yes, they need to solve a need. Yes, they invested in this product to do A, B, and C. And yes, they want the product to work. But what I took away is they're investing because they went on a journey with a person. They built a basis of trust. And then assuming that that individual, the seller, invested in that trust relationship, then they are willing to advance trust in whatever their next role is. And it could be in that same company, could be in another company, because they believe that you're going to come with their best interest at heart when you have a conversation.
Yeah. And even, so one of I'm going back a little bit, but the Echelon started as, okay, and I gave these guys an award. So if a health leader mentioned you, I gave them this nice little package, and I gave them, it says Echelon, and I put the words that this health leader said.
That's a really cool idea, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's just neat. Like, set it up there. When have you really understood your impact? Who's really told you that? And I want us to know, because I think this is an excellent profession. I think we're amazingly impactful. We don't talk about it. The burnout rate is 79% plus in sales and tech companies, which is, abysmal in my opinion. And so we need a lift. We need a lift. Yes, we need to rise up in how we do the job, but we need a lift. And I know that you guys are working on that too. Yeah. So, but Absolutely. There was one guy who, and he's so if you go out to the website, so Jason Glebe, he's at Athena Health now, has been there for a long time. But the CIO who mentioned him, when I asked them, like, has there been anybody who's exceeded these expectations? He said, yeah, and he gave me all these reasons, but the biggest one was, I've bought from him twice. I'm about to buy from him again. And he just gets me. He helps me through the process. It's like, I remember him saying that there was a scheduling issue, and they wanted to be able to, as a health organization, bring more kind of underserved population onto the schedule, that they were having a hard time finding spots. And so not only did, like, Jason help with the tech side of it, but he helped him kind of navigate the overall solution and challenge, both between Athena and then them as a health org. And so it's those kinds of things that you don't forget. Yes, the storyline of helping underserved onto the schedule, that's really cool. But, helping somebody solve for that you don't forget that.
Yeah. You talked about this just a little bit earlier. You used the word leadership, and I want to focus on that for just one moment. I'm sure this individual, Jason, probably innately has character traits, instincts that put him in a position to do the things that are then being rewarded in the way that you described. I would also venture a guess that part of his success has most likely come from leaders who have set an example, have set a framework, and have poured into him. I was listening to another podcast, and the individual was talking about one of the challenges, especially with the chief revenue officer role. And this wasn't specific to healthcare, it was SaaS companies overall. And the scenario that they were articulating is that these SaaS companies that grew up over the last 4 years were focused on hyper growth, which really meant new logos and churn didn't matter. And so they were opining on the frustration they had with leaders who had grown up in that space, where they had blinders on and they almost did not want to listen to the current clients, because they figured, hey, I'm going to replace you anyway. I'm going to get enough new logos that I'm going to replace you. And what I took away from that is that's a deficit of leadership. And that is not necessarily the type of leader that you would want in your organization. So Amie, I'd just be curious, what are elements of leadership that set people like Jason up to be successful, to do those things that get a client, a customer to buy time and time again, even if it's not at the same organization?
The simplest answer is you've just got to be human.
Yeah.
That's just the simplest answer. And then also understanding as a leader that you're leading people.
Yes.
Right. The number one job of a leader, or if you are a leader, you're in the people business, right? You're not in the selling an EMR business. You're not in that your business are the people, because it's your people that actually do the work. And so I think that's a misconception a bit. Like we take these CRO or CSO, CGO, CCO. I mean, there's so many letters now. And we get in there, and the natural tendency, because it is so tactical, is, okay, we need a better sales process. We need to put some more butts in seats. We need a reorg. We need like all of those motions. And that's really important. And then all of a sudden you start to get that done. And then as a CRO and a CSO, you realize that you have this big book of work to manage up. And it looks very different than it did in the past. A lot of times, well, over the last decade or so, is because a lot of institutional investment, like you're now much more board facing. And there are reports and spreadsheets and discerning of numbers and all those things. And so you just get sucked into where you're being called to be by your leaders, the cross-functional alignment of, okay, this isn't working product and then support and all, kind of things. And all of that comes at the sacrifice of team.
Right. And by the way, the expectations to do all of that within a time period that may be unrealistic.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I'd love to talk about that, but go ahead and finish your point.
Well, I just think it's, the words that I use are sales team as a growth strategy versus just a vehicle to deliver a number. And if we thought about them, just practically speaking, think about you're putting together a board deck and you have to report out. It's Q1 and you have to report out, what's something that you're going to do. And it should be a line item. It should be a bullet on that report from the sales leader of my focus. And if for no other reason than for your own, use it as a reminder to yourself. You've got to spend time and be present with your team. And one thing that I know, I don't know Jason terribly well, but, I did my own podcast with him kind of, thing. And he's out on the website, his story, and he is present. He is present and with his team. And yes, he's done the job before, so he knows a lot of those ins and outs. So he's a good mentor as a leader. But I think that there has to be more intentional focus on the team dynamics if you really want a high productive team who's going to achieve these double-digit growth numbers that we're handed every single year. And the reality,
clockwork.
I mean, every time. And, we get the question of how do you handle that? How do you handle this double-digit growth number? What do you do? Which I can tell you what I do. But it cannot be at the sacrifice of the team. It just can't be.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I do want to touch on dealing with and grappling with growth numbers. But before we do that, I would absolutely agree and emphasize what you just talked about in terms of being present. Certainly one of the things I've seen throughout my own career is that there's a lot of pressure as you move up into leadership to be more insular. And you described it exceptionally well. Reports, PowerPoints, board presentations, time with the leadership team. But what I've seen, what I've felt, and what I've heard is that you can't truly know how well or how challenged your team is, whether that's sellers, client success, revenue operations, marketing, whatever those team members are, until you spend a day in their shoes, until you're sitting in front of a client and seeing how they're talking. How do they position the product? How do they deal with objections? Until you're sitting on the call with the product marketing person that's trying to explain the content to your sales team, or any one of those scenarios. There's no magic other than being in the moment and then taking away those lessons and then adapting for how you empower the team. You talked about dealing with growth expectations. So we somewhat intentionally named this podcast The Counterweight. And part of that was born from the experience that James and I have had and what we've heard from our counterparts, people who've been in these leadership positions, who are in these leadership positions, which is that, as you just said, there are growth expectations that come with the job. And sometimes those growth expectations match what you as a growth leader believe is possible. Sometimes they don't. How do you navigate? What are some of the things that either you've seen or you recommend or that you've done yourself to navigate that conversation and be a counterbalance, be a counterweight, if you will, to what people may believe is possible in the market that you're serving?
So I'll start. I'll start with this. It's okay to have an emotion about it, and emotion.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes we're expected to like take it and then just be like,
okay,
all right, I'm figured out. Stoic.
I'm going to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's okay. So, and I'll just tell you my personal story with the first time it happened. Well, maybe not the first time, but I feel like it always feels like the first time. But I was flying in to a healthcare conference, and my CEO and my COO was there, and they didn't, or were going to be there. They didn't get in till late, and we were coming back down to just kind of chat about the plan for the next day. But on the way there, we'd gotten back from our investors some validation around the number and what everybody was expecting it to be. And there's nothing worse than sitting on an airplane, 30,000 feet in the air, stuck in your seatbelt, right? Surrounded by 200 people. And you get this number and you have this almost out of body experience. You're like, what is wrong with you?
Did you push the call attendant button? Like,
yeah, bring the bar cart.
Yeah.
And so we get there and we meet that night, and we laugh about it to this day, but both of them are like, you were pissed. And I'm like, and I was, because, and my point was this, and I'll get to answering the question, but my point was this. The reason why I am pissed is because the person that this looks bad on at the end of the day is me.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. I try not to be a prideful person, and this isn't a prideful comment. It's just the reality is, unless I come up with some sort of magic wand or pixie dust, I will chase a number, and I will chase unrealistic numbers because I just believe I can. I believe it's possible. I'm a glass half full person. But when it gets that unrealistic, you start thinking about your reputation. You start thinking about your ability to succeed. What blacklist am I going to be on now? Now that there's so much institutional investment, private equity, venture capital into the health tech companies that we all lead from a growth perspective, I have got to know it's achievable. And then if you take yourself out of the equation, I have to be able to communicate to my team that it's achievable.
Yes.
Right. Because if their mind game, if their head state is not right, we're getting less than the actual productive value. And, I'll throw a few stats out there. I've read a few places and I use this one, but you get 25% out of your team for the salary you pay them.
Interesting.
You get, it's the leader's job to source the other 75%.
Yeah.
And that's what we're dealing with. There was a whole study done on the mental state of sales. And I found it extremely fascinating. And the reality is, if you take the top 3 reasons that they like the job, they stay in the job, or what they want from the job, in the top 3, when you ask them that directly, and then you survey them separately, and then watch their actions as a different, triangulate all of those things together. Because a lot of times what people say and then what they do are different. Most of the time, actually, is they want to know that they're making a difference, right? They want to know that the number's achievable. That came up consistently. So you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They want to know that I'm going to be able to achieve what it is that I've been asked to do. I want to do a good job, and I want to be really good at it. But then they have to know that they're making a difference too. So it's all of those things kind of come together in terms of the state of the sales team and why an achievable number becomes an important part of it. Now, I guess full circle back to the question of what do I do? I break it down. So, so even in the Echelon, I just posted, I think last week, just a template, a leader could use that. How do you break down what you can go achieve? Because when you're managing up to a board, it's like science. To them, it's science. It's MBA.
Right.
When you manage down, it's how do you find the motivators for each individual on your team so you can tantalize them so that it's like coaching, right? You think about a basketball coach. right? They don't talk about the number. They talk about, they knew their people, and that's what you have to do in terms of managing down. But the managing up and then making sure that you have a whole story for your confidence, and then having the story down and up, is you've got to break it down. So, I have this many customers and this many own it, this many don't own it. The average deal price is X. Do the math. Here's how much we have left. Here's how much we've already sold. This is my beachhead. This is my potential. And then you break it down that way, and you come up with a number yourself. Like, you don't just take the number, you come up with the number yourself. And then you balance that against the number you're given. So both, you do that on the new business side as well as the expansion side. It's harder new business. It's a little bit more guesswork. And then you have that conversation, and you don't not have that conversation.
Can we go back to the airplane moment for a second? You were pissed that the number was unrealistic. And is that because you provided context, had you and your team given your perspective, and then others had said, no, it needs to be this? Was there that dynamic? Was there a back and forth? Like, how did it get to that moment?
Yes. So, well, yes and no. So going into that conversation, it was spreadsheet work, right? Up until that point, it was like, okay, here's how much we've done in the past. Here's how much pipeline exists. Here's what we think we could do. And if we just did some nominal growth year over year, here's what we really need to achieve, to make the kind of progress that the board wants to get to their end state. And the answer usually is somewhere in between. And so there was spreadsheet work that had been done. But when I say, like, as a sales leader, it's a negotiation. Like, it really is a negotiation.
It's a sales process.
It's absolutely a sales process.
So, right.
So
it's that cycle of, there was a growth number, they hired people, we hired a sales team. Why aren't we hitting the number? So we're not doing that investment thing anymore because it didn't work. So then it's right. And then there was, Doug, I think that same post you were talking about that vicious cycle of new CRO then.
That's right.
So we replace, whole new team comes in, all those relationships, pipeline, et cetera, that were built, start over.
Yeah, no, that's right. I do want to touch on Amie, because this just absolutely resonated with me, the way you frame this. And I'll be the first to say, I have probably been ill prepared, which is my own fault, stepping into some senior leadership roles to do what you just recommended, which is understanding that communication up, especially in the companies that are VC backed or PE backed, is more of a science than a persuasion. And you touched on a couple of these things, but they really just hit home with me. You have to be able to articulate. First of all, you have to have your own opinion. You just can't simply take what's given to you, wrong, right, or indifferent. Two, you have to articulate the math. You have to show your work as to why you're suggesting a different number or different objective. And probably one of the things that jumps off the page to me, if you have an objective that says your average deal size is X, and today your average deal size is 2.5 times smaller than that, it is probably unlikely that you're going to magically make your deal size 2.5 times bigger to get to this number. And that's not the only metric, right? There's you rattled off a number of these, but I'd love you to react to this. But I think being methodical as a leader, when you think up and recognizing that from day one, that is the path to success in changing the board's mind, your CEO's mind. But you have to think differently about then how you communicate to your team. Like, those are two different things that you have to hold in tandem with one another.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's one of those things that you don't, when you're in the role and we're all very busy, work starts before the sun even rises every day. And you just don't really think about it that way.
Yeah.
until somebody says it and you're like, oh yeah, God, it is. And so the role of a sales leader, CRGS, whatever, VP of sales, AVP of sales, is much harder now. And we just don't give that enough credit. We think it's this, if I'm scrappy enough, and you do have to be scrappy. But I think what gets lost in translation between the board and the sales leader is the freedom to be scrappy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And
go ahead, James.
Well,
Yeah.
I was
going to say, like, your comment of emotion, like having an emotional reaction, I think for me, I steered away from that because I was fearful that I would be perceived as, well, he can't get the job done. So it was almost like the people pleaser in me, or, we all want to make people happy, right? That's part of sales, is, well, I can do it. I'll figure out a way. Let me just pull up my bootstraps and figure it out. But your point about having an emotional reaction, but not in an unhinged way, right? You didn't throw a tirade on the airplane, or maybe you did, but I don't sense that you did. You then took that and you went and you got the data and you worked with your C-suite team, and it was a back and forth. So you channeled that versus, oh yeah, we'll just figure this out, or having a emotional reaction. So that's one of my takeaways from this conversation is, you can still have the emotion. It's not a bad thing. We're all humans. Be human. Now take the data and negotiate and utilize that to try to create an outcome that's maybe more realistic.
Yeah. And there's 52 card pickup that happens when you're a part of a company that is going through M&A.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times you'll get that number because there is a thesis that is you're trying to make this motion work based off of the thesis of the acquisition. And so you're given a bigger number. And, that throws another wrench in the whole conversation. But what I think it emphasizes is a few things. I know I took your answer, James, and I took it a different way, but you have to have a really strong ops team. I have underplayed that and not undervalued. I've understood the importance, but is so critical. Is so critical. You have to have a really strong ops team.
And can you define that when you say ops?
So sales ops. So, sales ops. The people I had a guy who was my sales ops person. What I loved about him was that he was wicked smart. Like numbers, what's that TV show, right? Like, I swear.
Numbers. It was a great show. Yeah.
Numbers. He saw them, right, in ways that I didn't, but he also knew how to work with me. So a strong ops team means somebody who understands the number, but they're not just spreadsheet jockeys. They have to have high EQ as well, because to work at the pace and the intensity of most CROs, CSOs is hard, right? Because we're pretty intense people, because we want to succeed and we want everybody to succeed. We're highly empathetic people. You throw us into a spreadsheet and you make that be our primary work effort, it's catastrophic.
Yeah. I want to make a shout out to our listeners. First and foremost, one of the things I hope people take away from this is that to do this job well, especially as you move into a CXO type of role in a growth, whether it's chief revenue, chief growth, chief commercial, et cetera, there are things you need to know and you need to teach yourself to go up and go down. And you can't do that alone. Find a community like the Echelon. Find a community of peers where you can be transparent, where you can be candid, where you can ask the things that you don't know. I wish I would have had that. I would have been a better leader if I would have had people beside me that I could have said, I don't know what I'm doing here. What have you done? What are some of the things that you've used? All the things, Amie, that you've articulated. I think those are just incredibly powerful. And I think people out there that listen to this episode, whether they're in a leadership role, they aspire to be a leadership role, your best path to success is to surround yourself with people that can be your stretcher bearers when you need help. And then you can then give help too. I do want to make one just observation, because we have talked about the value of being a counterweight, if you will, to our team above us. It could be the CEO that we are sitting with. It could be the board, et cetera. I think we would all agree, whenever they sit in a room, ideally they're actually sitting with us, right? We're a voice helping shape what the growth number, the objective is. The way they get to their perspective of what that is, there is a science to it, right? They're rational people for the most part. They're not making dumb decisions. They are looking at either what they think they need to create the health of the business, to reduce the burn if you're not profitable, to accelerate the opportunity to bring in more funding, or to serve clients better. Obviously, investors have a perspective that is important to them. I think the counterweight concept is not so much that you're fighting against an unreasonable expectation. It's that ideally they invested in you because you are going to provide a different perspective to help them get to the right number, the right concept that continues to put this company on a growth trajectory.
Yeah. But to hook onto that, Doug, I was in a call recently where, we had a chance as operators, on the same call were operators and then investors. And operators could ask questions of investors in this very just neutral, you're not my investor and I'm not your operator situation. And one of the things that all the investors said, because it's easy to put them in a box too, is they don't see enough of relationship building between operator and board. And they want to see that. So I would tell CROs, CSOs, sales leaders, is they are part of, they're your customer base to a certain degree. Get to know them just like you would get to know a CIO, and they're there to help you. That's why they're on the board.
It's interesting. Several early stage companies that I've worked with for or consulted, I would ask them, like, how did you get your early customers? Like, how'd your best customers? It was through their board. Their board members were teeing up those leads. You talk about soft knock, warm intro. Like, those board members were providing those leads, those early customers, and then they stopped doing it. Like, why did you stop doing that?
Yeah.
They have tons of relationships you could leverage. So if for no other reason, you should be utilizing your board members, your investors, for lead generation at the very least. But to your point, Amie, like, they should not be just seeing you at the quarterly board meeting.
That's right.
Every 6 months. Like, you've got to build relationships.
Yeah. And like referrals, your board, exhaust your options. If the sales leader has such a, stereotype externally, or sales has but the sales leader has one. We all think that we have to be this version that we've seen that is probably more the 20th century version of who we are today. And it's just different. And so it's okay to be real. I guess is maybe the way to say it.
So Amie,
absolutely.
You've shared just a ton of wisdom, some really, really great observations. And I'm sure that you've had this throughout your entire career. You probably entered sales just having all of this wisdom and observations. But if that is not the case, just for a moment, take us back. How did you actually get into a sales role, and what did that journey look like early on in your career?
I think there's always something planted in us a little bit, that if you look back, you're like, oh, I could have seen that I would end up in sales, right? But hindsight's 2020. We live life forward, right? We understand it backward. And so I think there's
that phrase. That's really good.
there's a little bit, of that. So I think some of it was upbringing that, I ride the line between introvert, extrovert. And, I charge by myself in my room, like, don't come in. But I love people too. And so you do both. So there's that. But then I actually started an EMR implementation straight out of college. There was somebody who worked for this big company, and I'm like, oh, and I really appreciated that person. I'm like, I want to go there. So I did. And I implemented. And, I was listening to Grant's podcast, and he had a very similar trajectory that I did. And I think there's a value in that too. So, there's a DNA element. There is the consulting that helps you be successful in sales. And then, so I did that for a period of time, but I also did it in 1999, which means I wasn't home for like a year because it was Y2K.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I still get questions. My kids were like, why is that a big deal? Like, what's it, which is a fun story to tell. How I know you're old because you implemented software before Y2K.
And they probably still don't believe that was a thing.
You're right.
Yeah.
Right. So I did that. And then it was a lot straight out of school. I wasn't married or anything, but I had a boyfriend. And I was like that, so I got off the road. And so then I worked internal and I supported the consulting organization. And then it was too much computer time. I was like, okay, now I'm behind a desk way too much. So then I went to client management, and probably one of my favorite jobs ever, because you're able to, the whole point is building a relationship and helping a customer. And sales, in my mind, if you were to like make it a math equation, is sales equals help. We're helpers. We love helping people, solving problems, challenges, and we like all of that. And so client management was really something that I love. And I still have some of my good friends in the industry are from somebody 20 years ago. And then I got into sales. And so it was a bit of a dovetail. At the time, the company was dissolving the client management function, which I still think was a bad decision, but be it as it may. Then I went into sales. So like that was my trajectory. But I think some of the best salespeople just know how to be very authentic. And a lot of those very authentic people come from this service-oriented state of mind. And sometimes they're found in the consulting org.
And is there someone along your journey, whether it was as an individual contributor in sales or when you became a sales manager, sales leader, is there someone that modeled the behaviors of a effective sales leader, effective growth leader for you? And how did they model that?
There's a lot of leaders that I look up to, but a lot of the leaders that I was working under, even at the time, still had a very 20th century mentality. So, I don't want to say no because I learned a lot from them in terms of like operationally how to org and be accountable to and structure and visual evidence of progress, the numbers side of measuring and monitoring as a sales leader. But the EQ side of it, I can't say. The one that I'm thinking of that was higher EQ wasn't as strong in the other areas, but the team loved him, right? And so like to the point we were making, it's a balance and you have to do both. And I even think about, there's a playbook I'm launching soon. It's called the Impact Recognition Playbook. And it is purely developed and it's super simple, strategic. Like I was a sales leader, right? We don't have a lot of time for learning, right? Don't make me sit through a full curriculum, make it quick and easy. Like that's the principles behind it. But it was developed purely out of what I didn't learn until the end of my corporate like sales leadership career, which is the power of recognizing the impact of your salespeople as a motivating force to keep them going when you're not looking and you're distracted by the board, but also in general to get to that 75% we talked about earlier, right? And it's a constant. The most exhausting part of most rewarding part of leadership, in my opinion, are the people, but the most exhausting part of leadership are the people, right? They say it takes 2 weeks. Like if you do this big, like even it's like, think of sales kickoff. You do this big sales kickoff. 2 weeks later, you've lost that momentum. It takes 2 weeks for anything big or small that is motivating in intention for it to wear off. So as a leader, you have to constantly be thinking, what do I do now? What do I do now? And this isn't like validating or participation trophies or like, it's none of that, right? Like you don't recognize people for the job they're expected to do. Yeah. You recognize people for the job that was above and beyond, and or the behaviors that are in alignment with your values, and or the behavior that's in line with your organizational objectives.
Yeah, being intentional about it.
Yeah.
Having a rhythm to it.
Well said.
So in that vein, this is probably a good time to talk more about the Echelon.
Sure, yeah.
We're super excited about the work that you're doing. So number one, we're going to make sure we put the website up here on the screen and in the podcast. Share with us so you talk about like the community, the talking about these things, sharing ideas. One of the reasons we started this podcast, the Counterweight, is because over the past several years, what Doug and I have experienced in the publicly owned, private equity backed, venture capital backed, Series A, Series B, D, whatever, there's just a lot out there. There's a lot of expectations, and we don't want anyone to feel alone. And I know at times we did. And there were times where I made so many mistakes, and a lot of it was because I didn't reach out. Mm-hmm. I didn't think even to ask someone else, like, hey, what should I do here? I just kind of put my head down, leaned on my instincts. Sometimes it worked. Oftentimes it didn't work. And I found myself going, man, what's wrong with me? Why can't I figure this out? Maybe I'm not working hard enough. Maybe this isn't for me. I really want people to know, and I know, Amie, this is a big driver for you, like, you're not alone. This work is hard. The expectations are higher than ever. There's a community that you can be a part of where you can talk about these things, get ideas, get motivation, and be refreshed and renewed on a regular basis.
Yeah.
If that's not already happening for you. And so can you just tell us about it?
Yes.
And how people can get involved?
Yes. I will. And don't let me forget to come back to this topic, but I have to applaud you guys for something first before I do that. You guys didn't ask me to do that, but what I get more than anything when I talk about the Echelon to people who might be potential investors, right? Because, just like what I've learned about mission and margin, right, is that you have to have margin for the mission to continue. And so that's that tension to manage. And same thing like with the Echelon, I want it to continue on. But when I talk, and so funding is important. But when I talk to people about it, one of the first reactions I get is, you're talking to a bunch of middle-aged white men who don't think they need help. Yeah. I'm just like dead serious. Like, I get that. And for the longest time, like that was never a thing. Like, it's just like, you guys are great guys. I've worked with you guys for so long. As a woman in business, I work with you guys for so long. And 99% of you guys are, you do have high EQ. You do want to make impact. Like, you're not any different than anybody else, right? There's just more of you in the role. And so I guess I never thought about it until I'm trying to start this thing that is squishier. And so immediately it's squishier. So people are like, oh, it's not results oriented. I'm like, but it is. And what you're forgetting is that it's people, and the people have to drive the result, and we don't talk about that. But I have to mention that because I get that resistance. I get the resistance of most of the people in a CRO, CGO role are men who just really don't want to take the help. And I just don't think that's true. And maybe it is for some, but I would argue that it's a time factor. We're all not very good at time management either. We're just not. And I used to use that as a punchline. I don't have time for time management. And I would laugh hysterically. I thought that was the best joke ever, and until I really needed it. And I took classes and I'm like, whoa, man, I'm a case. And so I just have to say that because, selfishly, it helps me kind of respond to that. But I also want to emphasize it because, to your point, James, if you are in this role, it can feel very lonely. And in the imposter syndrome is extremely real. Mm-hmm. And the people who end up sacrificing because you're trying to figure it out is usually the ones you love the most. You go home and you're frustrated and you don't even know why. And they're the ones who get, the crop end of the deal. So I wanted to mention that. Yes, there should be more women in this position. I agree. But I guess that's not the point of necessarily this conversation. It's just that I applaud you guys for doing it, because I think this by itself is breaking a stereotype.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those words. And I would echo back what you just said, which is if you are either in a leadership role or you are building to a leadership role and you are not connected to a community such as the Echelon, you're doing yourself and your team a disservice. And I can say that as someone who probably did not believe or think I needed that type of connectivity earlier in my career. Sure, I could watch people, I could learn from what they do, I would observe. It wasn't that I was blind to that, but I wouldn't take the extra step of being intentional about joining something like the Echelon. And I personally feel I would have been better. I would have had some different outcomes if I would have invested in myself in that way and learned from others. So Amie, I applaud what you're doing, the community that you're building, and quite candidly, the foundation that you're going to create for other leaders to be the best that they can be.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that. And on to the Echelon, it's, I always say it's an honor of sales and health tech sales. And it really is, it's a hard job, but we're people too. And we just want to do a very good job. And there's a lot of resistance in various ways, intentional and unintentional, that thwart our ability to be as successful as we want to be and create our own legacies. And so, the Echelon really it started as an unlearning. Then it became of what do health leaders really want, so that I can help my people like me understand that. It became an award for people who were applauded for their impact by the people that really know are the recipients of that impact. And then it became a community, because one of the things I heard along the way was we need a place to get together, and there's not one exists. And we just need a way to learn from others through their story, but also just the practicalities of it. Like, do you have a template for that? What about this? Or, the question, the random question of, how do I do this? Right. This is the first time I've run into it. Or, and within it, there's ask anonymously. Like, you don't have to expose yourself. You can do that. You can ask the question. There's a divide between sales leaders and individual contributors in there. There's a lot of shared things everybody sees together, but the chat sessions are separate on purpose, because I have to eradicate fear so that a sales individual contributor can ask a question without thinking that their boss is watching, and vice versa.
Yeah. That's good.
So there's little things like that we've thought about. And I always say it this way, if I'm the only one posting in the Echelon, it has failed. Right? We need people to engage and then, ask questions, and there's resources, and there's early release of podcasts, and there's templates like swipe files. There are skill swaps where people anybody in the industry can come in, like, I think I'm pretty good at this, or somebody said I'm good at this, and you get on for 30 minutes, you just show us how you do it. It's recorded, and you go out there and listen to how somebody did one on a territory plan. And I'd never seen somebody deliver that one in such a way that I was like, oh my gosh, just everybody do it that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's stuff like that that's out there. But the biggest thing I would tell people is just come in. It's a low monthly fee. At least it is right now, because I'm just trying to get volume of people in there and to get us talking. And, who knows where it goes, but it really is for everybody, and a way for us to help, navigate this really hard job as an individual contributor or leader sanely.
So we'll pop up the Echelon, how to find it, all that good stuff here as part of the pod. Amie, you referenced that you've listened to a couple of our episodes, so I think you may know what's coming. But regardless, there is a bit of a surprise, a little bit of a gotcha question that James is going to ask, and I will tell you there is a trend forming So it'll be really interesting to see
got
what
some
your
data.
reaction. That's right. We've got some data.
We've got our sales ops team
That's right.
has been crunching over this data.
I
So here we
actually
go.
haven't made it to the very, very end.
Oh, all right.
So I'm like,
even better.
so this is
Even
a
better.
surprise. So
Yeah.
you're going to get real here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Amie. First of all, thank you
You bet.
for being a part of the Counterweight podcast. We have just enjoyed every minute of this. There's 1,000 more questions we could ask. So hopefully we can have you back.
Would love it.
If you'll do that. And I really want to encourage folks to check out the Echelon. Not only the digital presence, the interaction in the community, there's events coming up near you or near you right now. So check those out. So here we go. Amie Teske, you've got a big client coming into town. They have requested Kansas City barbecue. Where do you take them?
Oh, God.
One place. You only get one shot.
Just one?
Just one.
Just one.
I'd have to go, Oklahoma Joe's, which is now
Formerly Oklahoma Joe's, now Joe's
Kansas City now. I would.
Gas station or other?
Gas station. Because I mean, everything else is like similar, right? Like that's different. Like I like to be a little different.
Yeah.
Right. And it has history. Like there's history.
And you can gas up your vehicle. You can buy some gum.
It's a twofer.
Totally.
It's the total
very efficient.
Experience.
You're all about efficiency and client experience.
Right? I am. Great question.
I will say, James.
Good job.
I think Joe's is in the lead. I think it is.
Joe's is in the lead.
Head and shoulders. Yeah. We'll get our RevOps team on
Currently.
it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, you guys. Thank you.
Yeah. Amie, this has been
Amie.
great. Appreciate the time. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. We are excited to bring new episodes out each week. We are incredibly grateful to our guests and our listeners. Let us know what you think by commenting on the episodes. We are proudly sponsored by the upper right corner, which provides advice on strategic growth, including growth assessments and strategy, go-to-network planning, sales leadership and team coaching, and fractional leadership roles. For more, visit theupperrightcorner.com. Waypoint Healthcare Solutions is also proud to sponsor the Counterweight podcast. Waypoint HCS is a focused consulting organization helping health systems, providers, and organizations to develop and implement patient engagement strategies. Waypoint HCS provides strategic consulting and patient engagement technology guidance and selection. Waypoint also helps support implementation and ongoing program management. For more, visit Waypoint HCS's LinkedIn page or waypointhcs.com. Thank you to our guests and our listeners. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Subscribe, like, and follow, and we look forward to joining you again next Wednesday for another episode of The Counterweight.